Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen-Chi Yu. Today, our guest is Isaac Stonefish, author of America Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. His book has been translated and published in Taiwan with an endorsement from our other guest, Professor Kuo-cheng Chang from the Taipei Medical University. So welcome, Isaac and Professor Chang.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Isaac,
it's my pleasure to join this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Isaac, why did you write this book?
I lived in Beijing for 6 years, and when I came back to the States, I was very surprised by
During what time did you live in China?
In the end of the Hu Jintao era, so 2006 to 2011. So I came back in 2012, and I was surprised to hear prominent Americans talk about China, not the way that Chinese people did, which was radically diverse, but the way that the Chinese Communist Party did. They would use these phrases like China has 5,000 years of history, and China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and China only wants peace. And I wanted to understand how it was that the way the Communist Party saw China had made its way to America.
And so, so going to Professor Zhang then, why do you recommend this book to Taiwan's readers? How is it relevant to Taiwan?
Oh, yes. I think it is a particularly informative book. Yeah, informative book. I agree with the author in variety of fields. He introduced a lot of things that Taiwanese need to know. China's soft power and their intention to let Taiwanese know what it wants you to know. I think the book have many important details, and the Taiwan also lacks of to-do list.
Yeah, you talk about China's soft power. I'm going to come back to Isaac. So you said you lived in China for 6 years. And so when you were there, did you already notice that America's elites were doing the Communist Party a favor by making all kinds of compromises in areas such as like freedom of speech in exchange for greater market and business access? I asked this question because there were a lot of exchanges about 10, 20 years ago between US and China, but it wasn't until Trump's campaign and his administration that the idea of sort of American establishment and elites became really popular. And they're usually often referred to as big businesses, Wall Street and Hollywood types, and especially how they're in cahoots with the Chinese Communist Party to take advantage of the average American people. So do you think those elites, ask those fundamental moral questions of their behavior?
When I was in China, I had no idea that this was happening. I was so sequestered into the way that the party wanted me to understand these things. There's so much insight that I feel like I only started to understand when I was on the outside. And I think most of what Trump did in America was disastrous. I do think opening up this space for a conversation about China, especially in the second half of his term, was very helpful for allowing Americans to start to debate, hey, maybe it's a problem that people like Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright and Hank Paulson have so much influence and are so influential in large part, or saying what they were saying in large part because of their financial relations with American businesses trying to work in China.
Yeah, so basically what you were saying is most of these people may not even realize what they were doing, maybe harmful. Maybe they'll characterize it differently to sort of the American interests. So I want to come back to Professor Zhang as well, because I think similar debates took place in Taiwan, actually around the same time. So Taiwan experienced similar transitions about 10 years ago from really intense business and people-to-people exchanges between Taiwan and China, and then to the rejection of the cross-strait trade service agreement. And there was a lot of student protests and movement against more ties and trade relationships with China. And so, Professor Chang, do you feel like that was a similar awakening moment?
No, it wasn't. It was not. Because China's economic development also enhanced its power to annex Taiwan. Yeah, so through the same language, China's soft power has been gradually influenced the whole Taiwanese society in a deep and comprehensive manner, even to Taiwanese political ideology and international perspectives. For Taiwanese, the Chinese political system is not attractive at all, but the synchronization has a huge attraction. It is more important than any agreements. Yeah, it's my opinion.
So, sorry, I'm trying to understand. You're saying the average Taiwanese people actually somehow, even though they were heavily influenced by China, but somehow it's not the same as how America is awakening to how much China is influencing America elites. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understand your point.
Because in the United States, China's government's objective is influence American society, but in Taiwan they want to unify Taiwan. Yeah, it's different. The Chinese government don't regard the United States as a part of China. They just want to influence the U.S. government policy, but in Taiwan it's different. They want to annex Taiwan and change everybody's political ideology and let Taiwanese to accept the Chinese future ruling. So the objective is different. So
the objectives are different, but the tactics may be similar, right?
Similar. The tactics are similar. Is similar in some fields. Yes, I see. I agree with you.
Yeah, okay. I think that's an excellent point. I think the Communist Party poses an existential threat to Taiwan. It certainly does not to the United States. And the goal of the party in the US is a pliant, a yielding America. That's why I called the book America Second, the idea that Beijing wants to supplant the United States, make that seem like a foregone conclusion, and do it in such a way where America thinks, well, this is how the national order should be. Taiwan should rejoin China, or not even rejoin. It's always been a part of China. And how do we make that idea popular in the American intellectual bloodstream?
Yeah, and a lot of it is obviously through the entertainment industry, through their propaganda machine via the U.S. machine. So, I mean, what I like about your book is there's so much focus on Hollywood, the entertainment and sports industries, including the NBA. They kind of impose self-censorship, on issues such as Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tibet, and human rights. In order to do business in China, of course, that includes, a whole list of companies as well. Some even work with the Communist Party to promote their positive image internationally. But I would say on the flip side, Hollywood has also been the biggest promoter of America and has been shaping and creating powerful narratives of America or even certain other countries, cultures, societies, and history for decades. So how is what the Chinese Communist Party doing any different than other countries with power and influence?
The difference with the Chinese Communist Party is twofold. One is that China is so much more powerful than these other countries. So we look at Saudi Arabian influence in the US or Israeli or Emirati or Turkish. And we could think, hey, it's actually terrible how much influence the Saudis have in the United States. But Saudi Arabia does not jeopardize US dominance, US hegemony. The US is not at any risk of fighting a losing war against Saudi Arabia. It's not that the Saudi regime is better than the Communist Party. It's just that when you step back and look at it, the Communist Party actually poses a threat to the US and certainly to Taiwan, whereas these other countries don't.
So essentially what you're saying is simply because the sheer power of China is so much greater than other countries, even though, again, the strategy and tactics they are deploying are all very similar, right? Trying to influence the universities and the think tanks and Washington, D.C., Wall Street and Hollywood type. But whether Saudi Arabia or UAE or, even Russia, the influence is rather limited because it's not like they can undermine so much of American power. Is that what you're arguing?
I'd say the goals are similar. I'd say the tactics are usually pretty different. And I think the size really does matter. So in 2019, the United States traded 25 times more with China than it did with Russia. And that was before the invasion. And we have to understand that Chinese influence on corporate America and corporate America's influence domestically, and Chinese influence on Hollywood and Hollywood's influence domestically and globally are incredibly important. The way that a lot of these entities act as proxies for Beijing's interest, it's a very complex phenomenon, but it's a very, very important one.
Yeah, and knowing or unknowingly. That's been an interesting phenomenon. So, Professor Chang, and how does that work in the cross-strait context? We've also seen many celebrities being forced to say things like Taiwan is part of China in order to maintain their presence in China, and then Taiwanese businesses, same experience, or being punished if somehow they're found out that their founders or their top managers or leaders are supporting a different party. How does that work in the cross-strait context?
According to my personal observation, the influence from China is more important than any countries. Yeah, because China is Taiwan's the biggest trade partner, and Taiwan is one of the few economies in the world that have a trade surplus with China. Yeah, so China and Hong Kong account for almost 40% of Taiwan's exports. Therefore, there are many people lobby for China every day. Yeah, in Taiwan. Yeah, because they regard more cooperation with China as their core interests. Yeah, I think it's very obvious. So for the Taiwanese, the term the Sinization covers the economic, political, social, and the cultural dimensions. Yeah, cooperation with China is very essential for every field.
So I want to come back to that because, I think the ties between Taiwan and China vis-a-vis the ties between US and China, the former are certainly much more intense. So, and also just a lot more exchanges, right? Because of the location and because of the people and culture. And Taiwan's ties to China actually go way beyond the so-called elites. It's just at all levels. So it's a lot of like middle-class people, it's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of professionals, we all know people, friends, and family who actually work with or in China. So tell the international audience, how do those Taiwanese people actually think about cross-strait relations and China's influence in Taiwan?
I think firstly, many people are afraid of war. So they think more cooperation with China can avoid the war. Secondly, many people cannot sure the Chinese government's next policy toward Taiwan. Uncertainty is a very important thing because there are few channels between the Taipei and the Beijing. Yeah, there is not real diplomatic relationships between the Taiwan and China. So we just guess what is the Xi Jinping's next policy, and they are more powerful than us. So many Taiwanese people will be afraid of China's military power against Taiwan, but they want to earn the money from China. So it's a paradox. Yeah,
so you're saying it's quite complex feelings about China. So there's fear. There's also obviously the business and economic interest, which is very important to Taiwan as well, because a large part of Taiwan's economy does depend on China. But there's also no formal communication between the two sides when it comes to government level. So it's a lot more complex, obviously, this relationship. I'm going to come to Isaac. You pointed out lots of problems of the American elites. And so in the end, while I was reading your book, I was thinking, oh my God, what is his recommendation then? Feels so grim. So you made a bold statement that you think the US government overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party is the best strategy for both Americans and the Chinese. Can you explain why?
The biggest problems of the Chinese Communist Party are foisted on the people of China. So many of these issues we discuss are much worse for Chinese people, and it's very dangerous to try to say prescriptively, this is what should happen in China. It would be nice if it were the decision of the people of China and allow them to decide what their government should be. That's not the way China is set up. It's never the way that China has been set up. And the United States is in a very, very difficult situation because I do really feel we are getting closer and closer to war with China. Likely over Taiwan, but also possibly over Japan or Korea or the Philippines or Vietnam or India even. We are right now in a pre-war period, and the US doing things to reduce that likelihood without jeopardizing its own sovereignty, I think can be the best strategy. I don't think this is something that it's hard to imagine something that's more difficult than succeeding on this. I think it's incredibly complex, and it's a very, very large, long shot. But I think if you think what's the best for the US to do, that would reduce the chance of war and would have the best potential outcome for where China is and where China is going.
You also mentioned two other strategies in addition to this one. Do you want to offer them up here?
I think the other strategy, and the strategy that the US is most likely to take, at least publicly, is how do we reduce the influence of the Communist Party globally? How do we work to contain China? There's this big debate where China will say, hey, stop containing us. And the US will say, no, we've never had a containment strategy, but the US has been trying to contain China for quite some time now. Mm-hmm. And then the other strategy is a strategy Beijing would prefer, which is the US yielding, the US gracefully reducing its influence in Asia, removing troops from Japan, South Korea, allowing Taiwan to join the mainland, and saying the US needs to focus on domestic issues or it needs to focus on its own backyard. And we're happy to yield influence in the Asian region to China. That's the strategy that I least hope. I think that would be quite disastrous. And that is one of the main intents of Chinese propaganda is to prepare for such a strategy because it would be much more advantageous for Beijing's influence in Asia.
And which one do you think is most likely to happen?
I think the second one, the U.S. containment strategy of China, I think that's the strategy we have now, and I think that's going to happen until or unless there's a war. I don't think war can never be a foregone conclusion. In hindsight, we say, oh, this had to happen. Right now, in my mind, it seems likely. There's still ways to avoid it. But I think the U.S. will keep up that strategy until we are in an armed conflict with China on the other side.
And Professor Zhang, how do you respond to Isaac's strategy?
To be a Taiwanese, I want to watch as the influences decline. Yeah, and nobody likes the Communist Party. Yeah, everybody knows. So if the United States will contend China, it's good. But I don't believe that the United States or any other country is able to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. And China without a Communist Party may not be more peaceful. Russia is not ruled by Communist Party, but it is still an aggressive hegemony. So China is a big country, and this is a powerful country. So I think the United States or any other country need to face them carefully. Yeah, not just one policy can deal with any conditions.
Yeah. If containment works. Sorry, Isaac.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's a great point. I think we can look to the case of North Korea, which is a far more repressive polity than China. And if Kim Jong-un were overthrown, it's impossible to say if his successor would be better or worse for the people of North Korea or for the region. And so if the Communist Party falls, it could transition to a democracy. It could transition into some sort of demagoguery where a very anti-Japanese populace takes power on a very anti-Japanese platform, for example, which would be very popular among China, or it could be replaced by a military dictatorship, which would be worse for the world. So you have almost no control over the outcome. If the US were able to overthrow the Communist Party, which I think is a major, major if, and would have potentially huge costs for America, the reconstruction afterwards is very challenging. The Chinese Communist Party has been so successful at snuffing out any sort of independent power centers. There's no Catholic Church or labor union movements like there were in Poland. There's no opposition leaders like there are in Russia. There's basically nothing. Jack Ma was the closest thing that they had, and he probably never saw himself as anything like that, anything like an opposition leader. It's just he was probably the most popular person in China outside of Xi Jinping, and that's a dangerous place to be. And so there's no there. It would most likely be if Xi fell, he'd be replaced by someone else high up in the Communist Party, and maybe the system would prevail.
Yeah, because the Communist Party pretty much, is what's the percentage? Like, I think it basically the elites in Chinese society, right? So anyone who would be able to take control will still almost certainly come from the current Chinese Communist Party, just maybe a different faction. So, well, I think, we'll move on to another possibility and talk about a really important issue, which is so much of the, I would say, change of U.S. policy towards China, and also to a certain extent, almost like demonization of China. It has, created problems for Asian Americans, and in particular, I would say just, Chinese people. So at the end of your book, I appreciate that you did try to defend the rights of Chinese Americans and Chinese, highlighting sort of their contributions to America and the unintended consequences of anti-Asian hate due to the origin of COVID-19. But we also know that, history tells us most people can't be as nuanced when it comes to xenophobia. So other than just sort of pointing it out and saying we should, still treat Chinese Americans or Asian Americans with respect, and, there's a difference between the CCP and Asian looking people. Is there any other way to make sure this kind of xenophobia does not continue to grow?
I think that's a great question. I don't think we want to understate the influence of rhetoric. A lot of what I discuss in the book comes from the language that the Communist Party uses. And I think saying explicitly, 反华与反党不是一回事, you can be against the Communist Party without being against Chinese people, and being very explicit on the difference between the party and the people. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is diversifying the debate in the United States. Too many of the people who talk about China look like me. A lot of them are older, but it's the same idea. This is a debate dominated by white men, and the more different voices you have, I think the better the outcomes will be. I think the other thing is, this is part of how discourse happens, but anti-Asian is a lazy phrase, and people forget about how it's the very obvious differences. I mean, Asia is 2/3 of the world's population, and there's radical differences in identities between Indians and Japanese and Koreans and their American population. And I think we saw that highlighted with the recent spate of horrific violence in California, which was Asian shooters against Asians. And we have to understand those subtleties. I think the issue you bring up, Wenqi, is a very good one. How do you have a conversation, or how do you come up with a national strategy knowing that a lot of the nuance will be lost? And I think the solution to that is just the very patient, boring education and conversation. It's not a radical strategy. It's how do we talk about this? How do we get diverse voices to talk about this? And how do we allow for there to be debate? I am very worried about the idea that someone who's very supportive of China and the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a platform in the United States. And I think we need to have a raucous, open debate about this so that the best opinion can win, not the most favored or the one that has the most political or monetary backing.
That's a really good point. I think ultimately that's what your book is about, right? And so last question for Professor Chang, I think it's important to point it out. Same thing happened, in Taiwan, when Taiwan experienced some of pretty bad ethnic hatred between mainlanders, basically those who relocated to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek, post-war, and their descendants, and Taiwanese people who have been living on the island for the last few hundred years, right? If I remember, 2-3 decades ago, every time there's a political election, the divide between the two groups just grew bigger, and the hatred was really hard to manage. And now, while Taiwan has a more I would say strengthened single Taiwanese identity now, because there are just fewer and fewer of those mainlanders. Do you feel like it's no longer a concern or an issue in Taiwan now?
Yes. Yeah, because the Taiwan society and the politics is become more better and fair. In this case, the mainlanders have some privileges. Yeah, it's true. But now, our society and the political system become more democratic and fair. So the privilege is to decline. Yeah. So I think the Taiwanese identity will become more stronger in the future. Yeah, I agree with your opinion. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today. You both have touched on, you both have touched on many important aspects of, issues that are brought up by Isaac's book. America's Second basically argues that America's elites, with their greed, hypocrisy, and maneuvering, have become China's best lobbyists until probably more recently. This book's, Chinese version is available in Taiwan. If you're interested, encourage you to buy a copy in the bookstore. And thank you for watching, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.